On behalf of vMug, I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast, Optimizing Your Environment Before Migrating to vRealize Automation 8, presented by Sid Smith, Principal Architect with SovLabs. Thank you for participating in today's webcast and for your continued support in the global vMug program. Before we begin, I have 3 quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webcast will be recorded and available for you on demand. You will receive a follow-up email with the on-demand link, so keep an eye out for that. Second, a Q&A session will follow today's presentation. All questions will need to be entered in the questions window near the bottom of your GoToWebinar screen. Third, there will be a short online evaluation that pops up as you exit the webcast. Please make sure to take a minute and let us know of what you thought of today's session and what you might like to see going forward. Attendees from today's webcast who opted in at registration will be entered into a drawing to win a $100 Amazon gift card. A representative from SovLabs will email the winner following the webcast. So good luck. All right, let's get started. Sid, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. And I'd just like to thank everybody for taking some time out of their Friday to spend with me as we talk about this topic. So optimizing your environment before migrating to vRealize Automation 8. This is an interesting topic because of the nature of 8 and its historical difference from 7 and previous versions. One of the things I just like to go over with you is why you're spending all this time listening to me. And I've got over 12 years of designing, architecting, and implementing cloud architectures around vRealize Automation 8. I spent 4 years at Dynamic Ops, the company who originally built the product, 6 years at VMware after the acquisition, and since then 2 years at SovLabs, which we're going to be talking about today. And I've helped over 150 organizations achieve success with vRA. In this webinar, we're going to talk about 4 key topics. 1 is assessing the situation. 2, optimizing your environment. 3, narrowing your focus and how SovLabs can help. And then we're going to do a case study and take some questions and answers. Assessing the situation is an important piece of this puzzle. And for those of you that have run earlier versions of vRA, going back to 5 or 6 even, you've made this journey, right? And I love this picture because if you look at it, where we're sitting here, we're in our current version of vRA. We've got to cross this bridge to get to the next version, right? And if we're not careful, we can have some missteps along the way. So getting that assessment of where you currently are and making sure you're prepared to cross this bridge is an important piece of the journey. So understanding your current state of vRealize Automation 7. Hopefully most of you are up to vRA 7. If you're at previous versions, well, then that bridge probably is a little scarier than the one that we just saw. But there's 5 critical areas that make up pretty much 85% of the migration overhead when we're going from 7 to 8. And those areas, number 1 is blueprint sprawl. So we've seen a lot of 7 environments where you might have hundreds of different blueprints in your environment. And realistically, you don't want to move all those over, right? And ideally, what we want to be able to do is collapse those down and consolidate those and focus on the most important ones that need to get migrated over to vRA 8. We'll take a little bit of a deeper look into that. The second one is the reservation architecture and resource allocation. There's a big change coming from 7 to 8, where reservations don't exist in 8, right? vRA 7, we had more of an allocation-based consumption model. When we go to 8, we're looking at more of a consumption-based model rather than allocation-based. So there's a pretty big difference there. Custom code's probably one of the biggest areas. All these custom integrations that we have within vRA 7 aren't going to just easily move over to vRA 8. We've done another webcast in the past where we talked a bit about some of the challenges there, the differences in the EBS states, the payload that gets passed through. We're not going to dig too deep into that here today, but we certainly have some stuff we can help you understand, look at your custom code in more depth, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Software components and script execution is another one. The concept of software components doesn't exist as of yet in vRA 8, and there's some rumors that it may not exist in vRA 8 in the future. That's still yet to be determined, but there's some things you definitely want to take into consideration looking at the software components. And then the network architecture, how you're targeting and determining placement decisioning around networks in your environment. So these are 5 key areas that we're going to talk about when it comes to assessing the situation. And then just some general vRA 7 design principles for optimizing your migration. Ideally, when it comes time to do the migration, we want to cross a bridge that looks more like this, right? It's nice, it's sturdy, we're not going to fall off the sides, we're not going to fall through the bottom. We've got a clear, very safe path to get from where we are to where we're going getting the vRA 8. So ideally, we want to implement these optimizations before moving to 8. So start out by assessing where we are, looking at our blueprint architecture, looking at the custom code, looking at these software components and these other areas, figuring out where we can make these improvements today in vRA 7 so that it's ready when we're going to make that move to 8. The other important aspect to this as well is for most folks, you're not moving from 7 to 8 and 7 just goes away, right? These 2 environments are going to live for some time. We have managed machines in 7 with no path today to get into 8. There will be one in the future for migrating those managed machines to 8. But even, initially when 8 is adopted, both environments are going to need to be managed. And there's still some features that are coming in 8 that exist in 7 where you got this gray area where some types of workloads might need to be deployed via 8 or 7 still. And then especially if you're doing things where you have integrations with vROPs, you're doing scale in, scale out type operations, those things will probably remain in 7 for some time now. But ideally, we want to reduce that management overhead in the following areas, right? We want to try and reduce these blueprints by 90% or more. Now, some of you probably have pretty optimized environments where you don't have these hundreds of blueprints, but greater than 60% of the customers that I've worked with have pretty significant amount of blueprints, and it comes down to some of the challenges with vRA 7. You might have multiples of the same type of blueprint where, say we have a WordPress blueprint, but we have 5 different versions of it, one for prod, one for dev, one for test, and so forth and so on. But ideally, we want to reduce that, and we want to get those blueprints down to as few as possible. The second area is really optimizing the reservation architecture, because going to 8, we're not going to have that same concept of those reservations. So we can get to something similar to a consumption-based model in vRA 7, and doing that's going to help not just with the migration, but managing and maintaining both of these environments for some time. Reduce that custom code by 65% or more. One of the biggest things I see when organizations build these custom workflows and they put custom code in there is there's business logic in that custom code. We're going to talk about how SovLabs can help remove that business logic from that custom code and have that code just on the things that it needs to be focused on. And then, of course, software components, right? There is some ways of executing scripts in vRA 8. We're not going to get into what those are. But ideally, if you can take it out and put it into some sort of industry standard config management solution, then you don't have to worry about retooling these scripts through every different iteration and version of vRA or whatever you're going to consume it by. And it also makes them consumable by other means within your environment. But if we keep it inside of vRA, you're going to have to retool those scripts, move it over to vRA, execute it in another way, and still continue to maintain and manage it inside of vRA. And the reality is, vRA is not a config management solution, right? It is a cloud management platform. And simplifying the network profiles in your environment. If you're using vRA network profiles, that concept is going to change significantly coming into 8. There are other ways to consume networking. We're not going to get deep into that in this webinar, but there are things that we can do to help to really extract networking up and make it a lot easier to consume those networks, whether it be on 7 or on 8. So focusing in on blueprint consolidation first, again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but what we see is catalogs full of blueprints, and some of these are very similar in nature with just very minor changes. Blueprints being static, where somebody requests a Windows machine, it might be for prod, there might be another Windows blueprint for dev, or whatever those differences might be. It could be compliance reasons and things like that. ideally, we want to collapse those down and become a bit more dynamic with them, consolidate across OS and versions. So we can help consolidate these blueprints so that you can have a standardized approach for consumption and have, in some instances, even a single blueprint that can deploy your Windows, your Linux machines, and your different applications. Right? So standardize that consumption, not just across the OS and the apps, but from a consumption perspective. A lot of people will talk about, the vRA catalog, but people are consuming vRA from things like ServiceNow, using the vRA Terraform provider, hitting the cloud client, or using the API, or whatever it might be. And having a more standardized consumption model makes it a lot easier to consume vRA from all these different services as well. So be dynamic, do more with less. The more dynamic your blueprints are, the more dynamically you drive them, the more you're able to do with a single blueprint. So being able to take in these extracted inputs, information that we know about the request, and use those to drive the outcomes of what we want, not statically configuring these blueprints that become management overhead within vRA as they continue to grow. Blueprints do require some feeding and care depending on what's in them. If you have networks pinned into those blueprints, those networks fill up, or whatever the case might be, there's nurturing that has to be done there. So the fewer blueprints that we can have, the less nurturing there is to be done with them. So ideally, we want to narrow that focus, right? And if you think about your environment today, if you have these custom integrations that were you've built, and I've got customers that have upwards of 30 custom integrations. Moving those 30 custom integrations all over to vRA 8 is going to be a massive task for them. But you don't necessarily have to move them all. Narrow your focus. Focus on the ones that make you unique, the ones that you absolutely have to do. We start to think about a couple of things. One is their codeless solutions, off-the-shelf integrations that you can use for some of the integrations that you may have built in the past. Use them. It's going to make your life a lot easier. The ones that you can't get off-the-shelf integrations for, it goes back to the things I was talking about earlier. Don't reproduce your business logic inside that code. So those needed custom integrations that you're going to have to retool to work with vRA 8. They should focus on those create, update, and delete operations, just what that integration needs to perform. There may be a lot of integrations you built that were specific to 7 that don't need to go over, but it's important to understand what those are and what they're actually doing. And does 8 have similar use case capabilities built into what you are already doing with that workflow? But if you have to recreate these things, focus on the operations that they need to perform, remove the business logic from the integrations. This will do 2 things for you. Less code that you have to now move over. And 2, it gets you out of having to maintain that custom code every time your business shifts or changes a little bit. If we do this more as defined configuration logic within vRA, it's much easier to update and become much more agile. You don't have to wait for code changes as your business needs change. How SovLabs can help. So there's a number of things that we can do to help. And the first thing is we have a free optimization assessment tool. So we talked at a bit of a high level about some of these areas where you want to optimize. The blueprint reduction, the removing of custom code, removing of software components, and these different items. Our optimization tool was built with all of these in mind. It is not the same as the vRA migration assessment, which looks at vRA custom properties and some other configuration items in vRA. Our optimization assessment tool will look at your vRA 7 environment. It will look at your blueprints, and it will identify key characteristics of those blueprints and give us information on how much they can be consolidated, right? We can generate a report where you can look at it and say, I've got 250 blueprints, and we can consolidate you down to 15 or whatever that number might be. By looking at these key metrics of the blueprints, things that we know we can consolidate and cannot consolidate. It will look at your custom code and actually count the amount of lines of custom code that you have in your custom vRA workflows to give you an idea of how many lines of code you're going to have to look at when looking at these different integrations to move them over to vRA 8. We'll also look at those software components and look at what we can do to potentially not just alleviate some of the software components, but actually slim down the number of blueprints by not using them. So there's a lot of good information there. It is free. You don't have to leverage our modules to use the tool. It also gives you a lot of additional insights into your environment, all the counts of how many blueprints you have, how many software components you're using, how many XAS workflows you have, all the different constructs in vRA. It's going to provide you with a lot of detailed information that will get you started to further dig in and assess your environment. The second way we can help is through codeless integrations. So we do have 30+ different modules for vRA. And we're going to look at those modules for vRA 7. We're also going to look at how they can help you with moving to vRA 8. Some very interesting things that we have going on there. Centralized policy management, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then SovLabs Fuse, which is our next-gen platform, we're going to take a look at that. And that is what's going to provide the extensibility migration path for vRA 8, as well as multi-platform support. So the optimization assessment, it analyzes those 5 critical areas that make up 85% of those vRA migration overhead, right? The blueprint sprawl, the reservation architecture, that custom code, software components, the script execution piece, as well as the network architecture, and gives you a report to let you know where you stand with those different things and areas that you might want to look at and refine and make some improvements in. So again, free, gives you that detailed report that you can then use. When it comes to the codeless integrations, so we have all the foundational elements that you would potentially need, the naming, Active Directory, IPAM, DNS with support for those 6 different IPAM providers. We also have support for things like Ansible Tower, Puppet. So when we talk about those configuration management tools, those are great tools for getting those scripts out of vRA and into something that's more standardized and consumable. So as you go through, if you see some modules that overlap with some customizations you have, you might want to take a closer look because they can certainly help you maintain that focus on the items that you need to be focused on, getting them over to vRA 8. So our centralized policy management, and this is the one thing that can really help folks, whether you're running just 7 or you're looking to get to 8 and moving forward. And so all of our policies are built around creating these standardized policies in your environment that are built around your automation use cases and your business logic together. So we take these 3 things and they get put into a policy. And these policies are what get created with our modules in vRA 7 today. With those policies, we can drive them more dynamically with this metadata. So if you think about the slide that I showed a few minutes ago where we're taking in input from our consumers and using that to drive the outcome, we can build these policies so that portions of them are going to take in information and use them to dynamically drive the outcome of what's going to happen. The beautiful thing about these policies is they exist for all the different modules and components, so your IPAM, your naming, your AD, and all of those things. And they're consumed within vRA 7 today by our integrations to determine the outcome. But as we look forward, these same policies will be consumable by vRealize Automation Cloud, as well as vRealize Automation 8 on-premise. So the same policy that's created today within vRA 7 is portable for 8 and beyond. Why does that matter? So when we start to look at getting to 8, if we solve some of these problems today in vRA 7, we get rid of some of this custom code that's going to have to be retooled, rewritten to get over to 8. We can solve that problem, reduce that overhead, again, allow you to gain that focus, and all those things that are done in vRA 7 today, they're future-proof for tomorrow, right? So all those policies that get created are going to be able to be moved over and used and consumed by 8 as well. And the other benefit to that is, as we look at starting to get more adoption around 8, again, those 7 environments are not going away. So if we do all custom code, if we just think about that for a second, I've got to maintain custom code in 7 and custom code in 8. And those code bases are going to be different because the uses within 7 and 8 are different. The code's got to be rewritten. Now they're going to have to be maintained in 2 places until 7 can finally go away. We use a more standardized codeless solution like this. The policies that get used between both of them are going to be the same. So that's the premise of the next-gen SovLabs platform, which is our Fuse platform, which allows us to take things like the VMware Cloud Management platforms, whether it be vRA 7, 8, or vRealize Automation Cloud, connect that to the SovLabs Fuse platform, which then communicates to all of your integration points, becoming that sort of extensibility layer within your environment. If we start to think about and talk about migration, right? We all understand what it, or I think we all understand what it's going to take to migrate custom code. Code's going to have to be investigated, inspected. We're going to have to look at the API differences. There is no vRA plugin for vRO 8 like there is for vRA 7, which a lot of integrations were built around. Right, so all that's going to have to change. The EBS states are different. The payloads that get passed into our custom code at those states is different. Customers that are running SovLabs in their environment will have policies created for the different integrations that they need. And those policies can be migrated over to our SovLabs Fuse platform, which is our next-gen platform. So no having to rewrite code, spend hours inspecting that code, having to go figure out how to do these same things via the vRA REST APIs. It's simply move this policy over. That policy, those policies can include your naming standards, different AD policies for placement into Active Directory, policies for network selection for your IPAM providers, DNS record creation, all those different types of things, including execution of your scripts if you're using things like Ansible or Puppet. So again, if we can optimize on 7, get rid of all the stuff that you don't want to have to redo, get to a policy-based architecture like this, it's going to be much easier to migrate and move it over. But even without this, the concepts still remain the same. You really need to optimize that 7 environment, get it as code, remove the dependency as much as possible from custom code. So if you do have custom code and you're going to keep it regardless, get your business logic out of there, simplify the code so it's going to be easier to maintain and transfer over to 8. If we start looking at a little bit more into the path forward when it comes to the SovLabs modules, on 7 today, our integrations look a little something like this. When a blueprint gets requested, policies are assigned to it, which invokes the modules that exist in vRO. If we start to look at how that translates over to our next-gen platform, in first look, it could be a pretty big shift, right? I've got these integrations that are in vRO that are being consumed by vRA, and now I've got to move all these onto another platform. But it's actually a lot simpler than that. Once the policies are moved over, we can move one integration at a time. Simply flipping a switch, and we'll flip naming over to the new platform. We flip another switch, and now maybe we move over IPAM DNS. So the same blueprints that are consuming these integrations from the vRO plugin today can now be consuming some from the vRO plugin and some from the new platform as we programmatically migrate each of the different components over. And once that's migrated over, now everything's consuming from the new platform, and we see something like this, where vRA 7 is now able to consume all those different integrations that it was consuming from embedded vRO from a external platform that performs the same integrations. But the beauty of it is now we can point other things to it as well. vRA Cloud, vRA 8, Terraform, ServiceNow, or even just do straight up API calls. So there's a lot of benefits to this model. If you start to think about adopting vRA 8, you might have things going on other than just having vRA 8 and vRA 7. Many of the customers I work with have multiple vRA 7 environments. They're most likely going to have multiple vRA 8 orgs. Maintaining integrations embedded in each of these different platforms amounts to a significant amount of overhead. Even just doing codeless integrations today on vRA 7, customers that have our SovLabs modules. If they have 3 vRA 7 environments, they've got our modules installed in all 3, and they're maintaining all 3. Now, it's easier than maintaining custom code across all 3, but they're still doing all that maintenance. When we start to look at the Fuse platform, I could have 10 vRA 7 environments. I could have however many vRA orgs that I want porting to the same platform, all consuming the same policies, the same naming standards, all the same things. And so with the ability to do that becomes a significant reduction in management overhead. Things that aren't possible today become possible as well. We talk about ServiceNow. We do have integrations to ServiceNow today that allow you to consume vRA items from ServiceNow. But what if you want to consume just naming from ServiceNow, or naming and IPAM DNS? You've got other physical hardware that's not virtual through the automated platforms that you need to IP, DNS, get a name for. You can offer these services through ServiceNow. Consume these types of services through that standardized method, or those standardized policies that you've created that conform to your business logic, right? Those policies that are all wrapped up can be consumed for whatever the consumption model is. So if we look at a case study, migrating from vRA 7 to vRA 8, we've got a customer we've been working with. They've started adopting vRA 7 this year, or earlier this year, probably about in the last 12 months ago. And knowing that vRA 8 was coming out and on the horizons, the idea was they really needed to prepare. They did have a existing vRA 7 environment, so I shouldn't say they've adopted vRA 7 this year. They adopted our modules this year. And before we started working with them, they had over 100 composite blueprints in their environment. I believe it was about 130 or so. They also had dozens of custom XaaS blueprints. Now, these custom XaaS blueprints, many of them are being used to also call composite blueprints, right? So there's some challenges with vRA 7. Many of you probably have run into those, where there are certain things you have to determine up front before you submit the blueprint request, so that you can get the outcome that you want. So that's the situation they were in. They had dozens of these XaaS blueprints. Within those XaaS custom workflows, they were doing things like generating the host name, determining placement, determining network that it should go on, all these different things, which was a combination of custom code that some reached out to third-party systems. The other was just doing business logic that they needed upfront before that composite blueprint was requested from within vRA. So lots of business logic contained in there, and also get custom naming, placement logic, and all of those things there. They also had over 30 custom EBS workflows. Those are a significant amount of customization here, and it was becoming just too costly for them to manage. And as subject matter experts kind of turned over in the environment, new people coming in, a lot of learning curve on getting up to speed on these custom workflows, and not even just how to maintain the vRA workflows themselves, but the logic that was within them, especially the business logic. As the business was evolving and changing, a lot of challenges with getting the environment to support those changes. So they had custom integrations for applications such as Puppet, IPAM, ServiceNow, and others. And again, the custom business logic not only was located in the workflows, but in the XaaS code as well. So after we were done, they're down to one composite blueprint that's driven dynamically based on the inputs that they collect from the consumers. This gives them a lot of benefits. One, they're no longer managing over 100 blueprints. Two, zero custom XaaS blueprints. So all that business logic and things that they were doing in the upfront workflows we were able to do in vRA configuration. This is going to be big for them as they move to 8, because now it's just configuration that they need to plug into 8 or into our Fuse platform. It's not custom code that they got to rewrite to go over to 8. Aside from even just the integrations themselves that talk to the third-party products, you know, all the custom code that was determining that business logic is just gone, and is now just configuration. And we were able to do that as part of our property toolkit and our template engine, which is something that's core to our plugin platform. So they also adopted our naming, IPAM, DNS, as well as Puppet integrations, and to eliminate the custom code that they had to communicate with these different third-party endpoints. They adopted the model for doing dynamic-driven outcomes, whereas we see most organizations with vRA, because of the way vRA 7 is structured, their blueprints being a bit more static. Although you may have inputs coming in that's driving some of your custom code and things like that, it's not as dynamic as you really want to get to, right? We still see, I've got Windows blueprints, Linux blueprints, I've got 3 different blueprints for this app and 5 for that app. The more dynamic we become, the less blueprints we can have, and a lot easier it is to maintain these environments. So they adopted our codeless integrations for Puppet, IPAM, ServiceNow, and others, used these, our property toolkit, as well as our template engine to drive the data into these more dynamically based on their business logic, and the environment becomes significantly easier to maintain. So before we go to the Q&A, which went a little faster than I thought, a couple of things just to, so you're going to get an email. If you're interested in the free assessment, you'll get an email with a link where you can go to register for it. You can also contact your SovLabs account team if you have one, or you can just go to our website and register for the free assessment if you're interested in having that performed. On that note, I think we can open up the Q&A.
All right. Our first question that we have is, should I wait until Fuse has complete feature parity?
So that's a good question, and I didn't really talk about the Fuse platform in depth there. So our Fuse platform is actually going to be released in mid-July, but on its initial release, it's not going to have like-for-like feature parity with our embedded plugins for vRA 7 that we have today. However, that will take place into 2021, sometime around Q1 or Q2. But I would say no. I mean, if you think about the slide that I showed where I can adopt Fuse and only consume the integrations I want as I want from Fuse. You know, when we initially release, we'll have naming, and then following right off of that, we'll have IPAM, DNS, and AD. I can still consume that from 7 and then make those available to 8, while 7's still able to consume the other integrations that you need until they become available on Fuse, and then we can continue to adopt those onto the Fuse platform.
All right. Our next question, I hear vRA 8/Cloud will have similar features to what SovLabs uses today. Why shouldn't I just use theirs?
It's a great question. So yeah, with vRA 8, there are some out-of-the-box integrations that you can get with it, right? They've got naming built into the platform. But the naming that's built in, for example, is tied to projects. So each project gets its own naming standard, per se, and across your different projects, you could potentially have conflicts. If you have the same standard being used across multiples, you know, getting the same name generated from one project to the next is to be a potential issue. If you start looking at multiple vRA orgs, having vRA 7 and vRA 8, your naming, you could be producing the same names. The out-of-the-box naming doesn't do validation. One thing, we didn't get deep into the different modules that we provide, but one thing that we really put a heavy focus on is enterprise-grade features like validation. Right? So all of our naming does validation. When we look at Fuse, name generation is being done centralized. So you won't have those issues where somebody requests a machine from vRA 7 and somebody requests one from 8, and we have duplicate names being generated. And that same principle applies to the IPAM, the DNS, the AD, and all those things, right? And if you want more information on the Fuse platform, definitely, reach out to us. We have some great demos we can do on it, and there's lots of other great things built into it, like insights into what's actually happening in your environment. It's one of the challenges with vRA as well. And it might have some built-in integrations. I know there's Ansible in there and some things, but when a blueprint gets requested, it's very difficult to see and understand what integrations got invoked and what was the outcome of those integrations. And that was a big point of focus for the Fuse platform, is providing the insights into what's happening in your environment. Requests are coming in. What are we generating for it? What was the outcome? So you have that visibility into all these things that you really need to know and understand about what's going on.
Is Fuse a free appliance where we license each module separately?
Yeah, that's a good question. So while the exact licensing model for Fuse isn't set in stone yet, the appliance itself, there is some underpinning foundational elements like our property toolkit and our template engine and things like that built into it. I know there was some talks about doing a freemium version of it for folks. I can't say definitely that that's the case because it's still sort of in flux yet, but stay tuned. I think that'll be worked out pretty soon.
I'm waiting for vRA 8.2. Should I wait until then to start adopting Fuse?
I mean, realistically, I think we'll be releasing around the same time as 8.2. There's so many differences in vRA 8 than there was in vRA 7. I always tell customers, the sooner you start working with it, the sooner you start learning about it, the better, because it's not one of those things. And for those of you that have been down the road of upgrading across different versions, most notably from vRA 6 to vRA 7, you understand things are changing pretty extensively here from 7 to 8, and there's going to be a lot of planning, right? That assessment up front. So, I mean, in order to properly assess your environment, you really got to kind of understand 8 and its architecture and how it works, and really have a good feel for it. But so there's no clear answer on that. You may not be looking to move to 8 in a production type setting, but I certainly wouldn't wait till 8.2 to start looking at it.
And can I deploy Fuse today at POC for use of the assessment tool?
So the assessment tool is not part of Fuse. We can certainly do the assessment without it. And I believe, so the beta, there's no beta open today, but there will be something coming in the not so distant future. So you can certainly reach out, and we can one, show you, do some demos on the Fuse platform, and 2, stay in touch so that when something becomes available, we can certainly work with you.
And that appears to be all our questions. Oh, sorry.
Anybody else? Any other questions?
We do have one last one. Is it fair to describe Fuse as an API gateway for infrastructure automation?
Yeah, I tend not to think of it as an API gateway, but more of an API layer. If you really think about your data center, there's lots of things that need different services. Like you need a name, it needs to be get an IP address, it needs to be put in DNS. These types of services are needed across the board. Your networking team, they might be deploying and racking and stacking new switches. Those switches need names, they need to be IP'd, they potentially need to go in DNS. Right? Fuse can be that layer that helps you produce those things in a very standardized way, so that when somebody comes from the network team, they can say, here's what I'm deploying. It gives them the name, IP, DNS, all the network information, creates the reservation in the IPAM, puts the DNS record in DNS. They just got to go put it in the switch. We see with every one of our customers, and there's no exception to this with all of the organizations that I've worked with, that different teams within the IT organizations are using different tools. You've got teams, teams today, Terraform is one of the hottest things for people to be using. And they want to roll out infrastructure and consume things using Terraform. Well, through Terraform and the Terraform provider that we're releasing with Fuse, you could consume all of these integration services for Terraform. We've got other folks that have teams that are doing things like that with Ansible, teams that are using PowerShell, teams that are using all these various different tools to get access to infrastructure. By creating this extensibility layer and putting your organizational policies in there, you can govern how these things are consumed. But don't confuse it with a cloud management platform, right? Because Fuse doesn't do things like, it doesn't spin up, doesn't do the lifecycle management of the machines. It's not going to be integrating with vSphere or AWS or Azure to deploy these workloads. It's simply providing you that layer to get the extensibility services that you need, regardless of how you're consuming it.
Okay, and we are officially done with our questioning. Thank you everyone for those who participated, and we'd like to thank vMug.
And with that, we're going to turn it back over.
Perfect. Thank you, Sid, and the whole SovLabs teams for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you. As a reminder, today's raffle winner will be notified by SovLabs after the webcast. You will receive a follow-up email with an on-demand link from today's webcast. To find out more about the vMug webcast program, visit vmug.com and check out the education page. Please make sure to complete the short online evaluation that pops up as you exit the webcast and let us know how today's session went. And from all of us here at vMug, thank you and have a great rest of your day.